All right, welcome to our super extra awesome last podcast before the election is held episode of Spectacular.
Woo! End of the election. Finally, it's coming.
Yes, what is it now? 1 week until the election's held? And
Yeah.
this marathon 11-week campaign will finally come to a close, for better or for worse.
The election everyone's sick of.
Yeah, well, it makes me feel sorry for the Americans where they think 11 weeks is, like, really short, so...
Well, and to be fair, because of how poor their candidate, stable is, I guess, this year, it seems shorter than last time, to be honest.
Well,
because the actual election is in about a year.
Yeah, well, a year's still quite a long time, and I'm kind of already sick about hearing about Donald Trump, so... Anyway, ours is almost done, and contrary to what we were raging on about over the last two podcasts, the NDP is doing really shitty right now.
Well, they're doing a lot worse than they were.
They've dropped like 10 points.
Yeah, but that's happened to every single party in this election, and I do expect them to come in third place, given where they are right now and the amount of time left. But when you talk about how, these like blowouts or they've completely lost everything, they haven't. They have a decent number of seats that they're going to get. It's probably going to be a minority government, and regardless of who is in power now, the NDP will still be in a position where they can be a balance of power.
Okay, sure, but I mean, I want to correct one thing you said there. The Conservatives have not dropped 10 points at any point in this election so far. The Conservatives have constantly had about 28 to 30, 31, 32%, something like that.
They've been up to 40.
They have a core base of support of people that will never vote for anyone else and do not think about it and just vote Conservative, and you will never change their minds.
Never change their minds, though. That's a strong statement to make, particularly when, if we're looking at this from our position here, like our personal position here, if we're going to start declaring whole thirds of the country as just unreachable, then we're basically fucked.
Well, I don't think they're unreachable per se, but I do think that Thomas Mulcair could personally save them from drowning and they still wouldn't vote for him. Just because, Harper's better for the economy, even though he's run 8 freaking deficits over the last 10 years.
Hey, now, that's the government economy. He's helped business. Those deficits have meant subsidies and assistance to businesses here and around the world. And that is a legacy that Harper will probably stand proud on whenever he's writing his memoirs.
But seriously, though, the NDP is really...
Yeah, it's not good, all right?
It sucks. I mean, Mulcair tried to out-liberal the Liberals, and as it turned out, you can't do that.
Nope. No one's better at vacuous, meaningless non-statements as the Liberal Party is.
Yeah, you can't beat them at their own game. I guess it all started with Thomas Mulcair saying he promised to balance the budget because that's important for some reason.
Well, because the NDP government, the reasoning, and it's a sound reason, but it's the same kind of reformist bullshit that, like the logic of it is the same kind of bullshit that a lot of NDP governments have sort of rested on before. We tend to balance the budget more often than our counterparts. That's something we're better at. Therefore, an NDP government should balance the budget. And therefore, that should be a centerpiece of our platform, since, coincidentally, it's something that is considered to be broadly important across the spectrum.
What bothers me, though, is that the fact that so many people have jumped back into the Liberal bandwagon shows how short people's memories are. Like, what happened to Bill C-51, where everyone was pissed off at the Liberals for completely selling out, and all of a sudden they forget about that just because it's convenient now?
No, I think they forget about that because the issue, the whole anything but conservative movement has explicitly had that position. I remember going to a C-51 protest here in Victoria, like, it was months ago. It was back in like the early spring, even before the election, and that was right when the NDP, like when C-51 was originally instituted, the polls suggested it had like a small majority of support generally. The NDP came out against it during that whole position, and as people sort of were made more aware of it and read it and sort of understood the implications of a lot of it, the support for it just tanked, and the NDP ended up ballooning. But before that happened, there was this specific protest where I think it was someone from like the Dogwood Society who was one of the people just there speaking, and he was talking about how we need to, appeal to the other political parties to change this. It's no good just sticking with ourselves and the people who already are against this bill. We need to be convincing those who do support it still. And he was specifically, and he explicitly said, he was referring to the Liberal Party who voted in favor of it. And that kind of logic just confounds me, because that's the same kind of logic where today the people are saying anything but conservative. Well, we can convince the liberals later. They're good people, and since this is about good and evil, they'll come around. They must, right? Because that's just how these things are supposed to work.
Right.
And it doesn't happen. The liberals supported that legislation for reasons that had to do ultimately with, I think it was a really bad decision on their part, but initially it seemed like it was the politically simple thing for them to do. In the end, though, the kind of attitude that people have of the Liberal Party and sort of the anti-conservative movement has been that it doesn't really matter. Politics isn't the issue here. It's these horrible people who are running the government that's the problem.
Right.
Stephen Harper is a terrifying, evil guy, and his policies are merely a reflection of that.
Right.
And Trudeau is, as far as I can tell even, he seems like a nice fellow. And so obviously he's just got the wrong advisors, or he's, didn't really understand what he was getting himself into at the time. And so things like C-51 can be kind of brushed aside as just not really that as important as just getting a decent fellow in that seat.
If Trudeau had been in power, for all we know, his party could have thought up Bill C-51 for themselves, because the Liberals have a lot more to do, or they're a lot more similar to the Conservatives than they are the NDP, which is why I think that Trudeau has refused so far to even consider the idea of a coalition government with the NDP. If we're talking about the anything but Harper movement here, this election would already be decided if the NDP and the Liberals were to agree with a coalition. It would already be done. And I think if maybe this election instead was sort of a referendum on putting through proportional representation, as the NDP and sort of the Liberals have both said, then they should have just done that. And then
I think it would have been a solid option for both parties.
I think so too, but they have their heads so far up their parliamentary asses that they can't see the forest from the trees. Where you could, if that were the case, and proportional representation was put through, it would be the end of the Conservative Party as we know it.
It would be the end of majority governments as we know it too, and I think that's really what it comes down to. That once again, more in the Liberal Party than the NDP. I do think that a lot of people in the NDP are more interested in policies than personalities, more so. But it still seems like it's not the problem isn't the autocratic nature of the PMO. It's who is the autocrat. That's the problem.
You don't think that? You mean that's
what they're thinking. That's the reasoning of it. So why would we want to spend our political capital reforming a system just to make ourselves weaker when we come in first place?
Right.
Keep things as they are, get rid of the most egregious, evil, cruel, and pointless shit, and then, just run things basically the same way. But in a good direction, right?
Yeah, Canada's democracy has often been called a benign dictatorship. Because when you do have a majority government, it doesn't matter what people say or how much they protest, be it Bill C-51 or C-54 or whatever else. A majority government can do basically anything they want. So I do think though that Canada would be a bit weird having constant minority governments with 15 different parties, but it would more accurately represent the country, and every other democracy in the world seems to figure out a way to do it themselves, so I don't see why we can't either.
Well, even an interesting example from the American side is they've had a fairly decent string of governments that they've overthrown in the last few decades, right? Mm-hmm. Every time the United States goes to a country, it replaces whatever used to be there. I mean, I'm thinking Afghanistan and Iraq. They don't ever institute their own electoral system.
Yeah, that's true. They don't.
Why would they? It's awful.
It doesn't work.
It's not very effective. It's needlessly cumbersome and divisive and complicated when, just a simpler, sort of straightforward like proportional system, maybe two houses. You have one that's, a national house, and the other is regional stuff. But like that none of that's, if we were to do that, if we were to say, what would be the ideal government for Canada, it wouldn't be this, right?
Well,
we wouldn't pick this from all the options if we had to pick again.
Yeah, that's true. Canada loves tradition, though, so, can't change that. That
Well,
would be too much.
I don't know. I think it would be easy to get through if you just said that it was radically different from the Americans.
Sure, yeah, we love that. And also, I think that's one thing that the NDP and Mulcair specifically could have done a lot better during this campaign, is hammer home that point of proportional representation. There are so many people, especially young people, that hate politics so much, that find it so alienating and boring and cynical, that would have been a great way to breathe life into it and to attract younger voters that want change like that, right?
Yeah.
Just say the NDP is the party of proportional representation.
And make it a referendum. Make every election a referendum about some major issue.
Yeah.
In this case, the referendum, it seems to be, it was the ABC thing. Are you for or against the Conservatives? Are you for or against Stephen Harper? That's it. That's been like the major broad issue that everyone has had to sort of weigh in on.
But the problem is that not the Liberals or the NDP themselves can garner nearly enough support for a majority government.
Well, you don't need a majority government to make the Conservatives not the government anymore.
Well, sure, but... Yeah.
And as far as the ABC is concerned, that's good enough.
What do you mean ABC?
The anything but conservative.
Right.
I think that is ultimately what they want. It is short-sighted. It is a bit disingenuous at times. But... that seems to be a goal that will be achieved in this election.
I'm not entirely convinced, though. I'm until election day comes, I'm not going to hold my breath. It's still totally possible that the Conservatives will have a minority government, and that Stephen Harper isn't going to get kicked out. I think it's very close to being likely, and I'm not going to rule that out.
I think this was something that the NDP was doing kind of more as a campaign idea, that they were looking at this as a two-election cycle for them. We squeak into a minority government promising as little as possible, well, not so much promising as little as possible, but as uncontentious an election campaign as we can manage.
Try not to be controversial now.
Don't be controversial, don't be too left-wing, kind of keep things... Pick issues at will and avoid divisive issues such as Palestine and things like that. Just keep that all out of the way. Just backroom it. Don't talk about this in public. And then once we get into a minority government, then we can sort of prove to the country and to business and to people that we're competent and cogent and stable, and from there, at some future point, manage a majority. And undo all the madness of the past, get rid of C-51 and some of the more egregious excesses of the Conservative Party. A lot of easy wins for your supporters, those kinds of things.
Right.
And then just sort of keep everything nice and flat and simple and ride it out until we find until there's, say, a crisis or an issue that we think we could probably squeak into a majority with.
Yeah, and then
kind of surprise the country,
As it turns out, trying to play the centrist card, well, there's already a party that specializes at that, and the NDP left the progressive card open, and Trudeau took it from them, and turned out like appearing more progressive than the freaking Social Democrats.
And every paper across the country has just been laughing at the NDP for the last 2 weeks.
I've gotten to the point, I was hopeful, like when Mulcair was leading in the polls and things looked pretty good for the NDP, I was like, okay, you know what, I've never been a huge fan of Mulcair, I've been an NDP supporter for like my whole adult life, and he's not been my favorite, but
really?
Hey, it seems to be working, so sure, that's fine. And then all of a sudden, it blows up in his face, and it's like, okay, you know what? At this point, I'm willing to just watch the NDP burn in this election just to prove the point that playing the centrist card is suicide for them.
Well,
I don't want... it hurts me to say that because I want the NDP to do well, but I don't want there to be an NDP government just for the sake of an NDP government.
If we're talking about it like that,
I want good policies.
Every election, every possible way this election could have gone would have necessitated some kind of lesson on the part of anyone, like any result, whatever it was. If the NDP managed a minority, they were going to say, well, here's why we did this. Here's why it happened. Here's why we were so successful. I do think that the way that the party had been going, particularly the leadership, I don't think they had... that if they had gotten a minority, I don't think they would have considered anything at all of substance afterwards.
Right.
It would have been exactly the same as the last election. It would have been the biggest victory we have ever had. It would be wonderful. Everything's fucking roses. Get wasted and go home and wake up tomorrow to a bright new day, and that's it. And then we wake up and it'll just be like a minority government doing all sorts of things we don't want it to do.
Yeah.
As it is, yeah. I don't think it's better if we lose. I think it would have been better for an NDP government to be in that position, because I still think that within the NDP there's this whole system of people and ideas and social democratic principles that would have forced itself out, forced Mulcair to take more explicit positions. Now, perhaps he would have ended up being like a Blairite. He would have just been Tony Blair, but for Canada. That could be the case, but at the same time, maybe that is a lesson the labor movement and the NDP needs to learn. As it is, if we're looking at this like the most painless way to drive these lessons home of being principled and not just going for the easy, lazy, simple win, this might be a less painful way of doing it. We get defeated here and now. There's a minority government. There will probably be another election in at least a few years. Maybe this is our opportunity to revitalize those ideas.
Well, I guess it depends if Mulcair steps down, depending on the result.
And what he thinks was the reason why they lost.
Well, I'm sure he will, whatever reason he comes up with, it will be entirely self-serving, and will, it's no fault of his own that it was the niqab issue, or it was the Conservatives bringing up xenophobia in
those
the campaign.
Are all, congratulations, kudos to the NDP for actually taking a decent position on this, I think.
Yeah.
Particularly considering, at first, and still to some degree, it has hurt us in Quebec. Not as bad as it seemed to be at first. We're still not doing very well in Quebec at all. But
aren't we in first in Quebec?
We're still sort of squeaking by in first. We'll probably get the majority of seats in Quebec, but our popular vote's been pretty hard hit there.
By like at least 15%, isn't
yeah,
it?
it's... I've seen a few polls where our popular vote in the rest of the country is now higher than in Quebec.
Right.
Which is weird, but the point being is that there's like 4 different parties we're running against. So it doesn't matter so much.
And they are also the most racist province we have. So
well, and also the most progressive. It's interesting that it's weird.
Yeah,
that,
it's
actually.
a bit of a...
but yeah, I mean, taking that position, the NDP Mulcair could have just like dodged the question, and possibly been able to just not have it wash off his back. I'm happy that he's enough he has enough principles to actually stand for these kinds of things. But at the end of the day, these are ultimately a matter of distraction.
Oh, of course. And I'm not exactly sure how the niqab issue started or when that started being an issue, but
we'll find out. I will bet you that we'll find out in 6 months to a year that it was down to the new campaign manager the Conservatives hired.
It seems to me something that the Conservatives would do.
No, but that new guy that they got from Australia.
Oh, right.
That was like the fucking hitman,
Well, it makes sense because you hit the NDP's base of support in Quebec, and that's where most of their seats are centered. It seems like a very Machiavellian kind of move, and for something that's entirely inconsequential. As far as I'm concerned, you could go ahead and ban the niqab, and you could make it just illegal to wear in Canada, and that law is going to get overturned by the Supreme Court within 2 years tops.
And for good reason.
So go ahead and pass the law. It doesn't matter. It doesn't follow the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So as far as I'm concerned, this is a sideshow issue that is completely insignificant insofar as everything else is concerned, and it is just a distraction, and it annoys me so much because it is so much like American politics, where it's all about these stupid little, caricature issues.
Wedge issues?
Yeah, and it's a distraction from the actual policies. So I do think it was probably thought up by someone in the Conservative Party at least. But what I really don't like is that it also exposes a lot of xenophobia that Canadians do have. and that we, just as much as Americans, are swayed by political propaganda and fear mongering in the media, and especially the sort of Islamophobia towards people of Middle Eastern descent, and it's shameful to me. I don't like seeing Canadians. I had hoped that we were a little bit more intelligent and reasonable than to get caught up in this petty bullshit, but I'm sad to say that we aren't.
To be honest, I don't consider it like a clear-cut matter. I think people are, like, when we're talking about sort of these fear-based, weird, unpleasant, like the sort of issues that make people unhappy and just emotional stuff. I do think a lot of it is it's fairly ephemeral. I mean, it does depend a lot upon the kind of priming that from the media and from politicians especially, for the public to sort of go, oh yeah, well, of course I'm against this. Of course we shouldn't. It should be illegal. I do think a lot of it is racist, and I do think the country does have a lot of racists in it who sort of are hiding behind the fact we usually don't talk about these sorts of issues at all. But at the end of the day, I don't consider it to be indicative of some kind of overall racist mentality that Canadians have, as much as it is a scam.
Yeah.
I guess.
Sure. I don't know. Both can be true. I don't think it represents a really, really strong current of racism in Canada. I think it's mostly just a sort of knee-jerk reaction to what people see in the media, and, ISIS, and they're scary, and so niqabs are bad, and it's all kind of, people have short memories, and they get caught up in the emotions of things they see on TV.
It's complicated, too. I mean, it's associated with identity, and I don't just mean that in, like, the sociological sense. I mean, being able to identify people and the oppression of women and all that, those sort of issues are all muddled together, and you can sort of pull any of those levers as a politician to justify about anything, and people will sort of go, well, you know what, I am in favor of women's rights, and if that means being against the niqab, then I guess I'm against the niqab.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's
that's
just,
really easy.
It pisses me off to see the election sort of blindsided by these sort of issues. We're not accustomed to that kind of crap here.
We were blindsided by real issues, too.
What do you mean?
Well, the refugees, which has kind of become another muddled mess as well, but that was not something anyone wanted to talk about.
Well, I don't know. There seems to be a pretty high support in Canada for taking refugees, but we're rather far away.
Far away, my ass. I mean, we have airplanes now. This isn't really an issue.
No, that's true. But it's just easier for Canada to sort of pretend like we're not part of,
Even though all we'd need to do is offer Hungary, like, the money for the plane tickets, and they would be probably happy to organize everything else.
Yeah, and as far as I'm concerned, we should take in as many as we can. Like, the amount of immigrants that we took in recently in this past year was way less than what we normally take in. And with the aging population that we have, like, hell, sure, send them over. They'll help us. It'll be good for our economy. It'll be good for our society. We should take more refugees.
We've been, there's plenty of problems with, like, where refugees end up settling in the country, and the fact that it ends up being basically just 3 cities, that sort of stuff, which I think, but it is a bit of a problem. All of that, though, really comes down to sort of the support network available to refugees when they come here. I mean, why would anyone want to live in anywhere, like, if your options are Vancouver, Toronto, or Montreal, and there really is no one you could possibly relate to in any other part of the country, why would you go to another city to live?
Okay, well, sure, but isn't that kind of besides the point? Like, it's not like there's no apartments to live in Vancouver.
No, but it's extremely expensive in those 3 cities. Those are the most expensive. We're talking not just about, 3 cities people happen to go to because they're just refugee centers. These are also cities that have some of the highest rent rates in the country.
Well, you know what? Maybe this is a swimming opportunity to multiculturalize smaller rural areas of the country.
De-gentrify, you might say.
Yeah, sure. And in fact, I heard that the Norwegian government was actually considering putting some refugees on Svalbard, which is rather close to, it's like a remote territory close to the Northern Pole. Like,
yeah.
It's like...
that sounds a bit too much like a just
horror movie.
Yeah. Oh, we have refugees coming. Well, where are we going to put them? What's the worst part of the country? Let's. You know what? It would be like us saying, let's put them on Victoria Island.
Yeah, like put them in Nunavut. There's plenty of space there. Well, I don't know, man.
1,000 acres and a snowman for each and every immigrant.
You know, I think no matter where the refugees would end up, they would be incredibly thankful just to have a safe place to stay.
Well, sure, but
the issue, I mean, we had a rally in Victoria for supporting refugees, but it's not like the municipal governments can do much anyway because they don't have the jurisdiction to accept them, right?
No, they can. In our case in Victoria, refugees generally don't come here. Although, they come here more than a lot of places, but compared to the big three, we're sort of we're not really an option. We have a huge, Filipino community here, things like that. But those aren't refugees; they're just immigrants. We're talking about people who basically are just coming with the clothes on their back and just hoping that they'll be even just in a neighborhood where people speak the same language as them. That is a difficult situation. I think it's great. If when our municipal government says we want to bring people in, this is something we want to do, so that at least in principle the federal government isn't probably going to lie about what the cities want, I
don't know. I think Victoria would be an okay place. I mean, we have a really nice mosque here. It's like a new building. It was built a couple of years ago.
Yeah, by Crystal Pool, right?
Yeah, and there's like a decent community here.
All right.
I don't see why not. I don't know. Do you think that the NDP could have made that more of a position in the election, like that they support taking more refugees?
As a crisis issue, no. It would have just be it was you. They did what anyone would expect anyone to do. They used it just as a punching bag,
The conservatives
aren't doing enough,
blah blah blah,
and they aren't, and they weren't, and they still aren't. It is a problem, but they really didn't have much to do. When you're talking about like peoples whose lives are at risk right now, and we're in the middle of an election, we can't just go and make decisions like that easily. The exact as a counterexample, you have the TPP, right? And that's something that's being negotiated by the government right now. And
no, it was just signed. They just
signed, yeah. But the NDP's position was you can't make big decisions like that during an election because that's inappropriate. Like it's not a resolved issue as far as the will of the country goes.
Weren't the conservatives going to try to close and sell off a bunch of CBC buildings before the election was concluded well?
There's been a lot of rumors about that. CBC and of course the Posties as well, similar sort of rumors going around about that. I personally don't think that the Conservatives will. I don't think the Conservatives want to dirty their hands on either of those issues. I think that their long-term goal would have been, assuming that they even stay in government, but it would have been to make sure that like the directors of those crown corporations were simply friendly to them and sort of favorable to their interests, and just slowly start squeezing them to death until eventually they're no longer viable, and then just let them go. While I think the Conservatives are hostile towards pretty much any aspect of government that they don't personally control, I don't think that they would have gone out of their way to destroy the CBC or the Postal Service or a lot of those other things. I do think the TPP is going to be a massive problem, but in a lot of ways it comes down to sort of political maneuvering more than the law itself. The reasons these treaties exist, in some cases, is A, to standardize trade practices amongst disparate countries, and B, to force future governments to not upset the apple cart and, be removed from this extremely beneficial relationship they have.
Beneficial, right.
Well, beneficial in the sense that everyone else agrees to it. If you get cut out of the loop, you will be harmed.
Yeah, except these agreements aren't free trade agreements at all. They're
not. They're
protectionist, anti-trade, pro-corporate
They're protectionist, anti-trade, pro-corporate, blah, 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 all that, yeah. But what they do is they standardize that process. And I think that what it does for a party like the NDP is it puts it into a rather awkward position. Because if you're Thomas Mulcair, and the leader of the NDP currently is, although probably not for more than a few weeks now.
Yeah, we'll see.
We'll see what he says. with someone like Thomas Mulcair, who's constructed his entire party on the basis of a bunch of fringe elements of principled, not principles, but like campaign promises, $15 childcare and a balanced budget and blah 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 blah, all this stuff, all these disparate little things coming together without having some kind of clear, principled, political theory behind your actions. He would be, as prime minister, completely outmaneuvered by the TPP, because he would basically be saying, here's the policies we want to do, and then looking at the TPP, we can't really do any of them, so we're basically back at square one. Unless you have some kind of sound theoretical foundation for these arguments, they just evaporate in the face of this kind of opposition.
And that's why I think that this really exposes Thomas Mulcair as the liberal that he is, where, and I don't mean like part of the Liberal Party, although he used to be, provincially at least, but just the fact that, you know, he only released the NDP platform, a couple of days ago, like a week before the election.
Yeah, which I have to say seems a bit late to me.
A little bit late.
A bit, yeah.
Especially now that they've dropped, like, maybe the only reason they did it is because they lost 10%.
Actually, that would be hilarious. Backing up for a second, let's say the NDP hadn't lost 10 points. Would they have still released the platform? would we even have a platform going into the actual election day?
I want to say yes.
Who even knows?
I want to say yes, but I guess you never really know.
Yeah, you don't.
So, I don't know. I hope that no matter what the outcome of this election, I hope that the NDP learns something from this, that
well, it does.
Even if we squeak by with a minority, which is like totally out of the question at this point, basically, barring some sort of miracle, I hope that it causes at least a new leadership race within the NDP and causes us to reflect on what are our principles as a party and how do we convey that to the public? What sort of platform do we want to agree on? What are we going to do?
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of things that the NDP could have done, you know, and even other policy things like just taking a stance on the TPP earlier on in the campaign.
Well, it wasn't an unknown
convenient.
issue. It was.
Well, I know. It was. They waited until after it was signed, right? And even something like the telecommunications cartel in our country, that's an issue that like none of the parties have talked about, but there's so much anger that you could tap into with that.
It's so weird that like we talk about this like it's a video game, that they only have so many points to put towards the issues that they actually care about, but that's a lie. The
Right.
NDP can have a position on every single issue that might even occur. We
Sure.
can have a viewpoint. That's what politics is all about, taking those viewpoints and having some kind of cogent reason that sort of underlines all of them, like all those different views. We could say, well, given that we believe, that education's important and that an informed electorate and an informed public is necessary for a healthy Canada, what does that inform us with regards to the current telecommunications industry? Well, what it says is that we need to have some fundamental assurances that everyone can have access to the internet, that service isn't used for the purpose of producing profit, but as a service. Those kinds of things. You can just draw those conclusions if you have some kind of competent, thoughtful philosophy.
That should be a chief difference between the New Democratic Party and the Liberals, that we do have some sort of, philosophy behind things and coherent policies. But I don't think Thomas Mulcair necessarily does. I don't think that he really comes from a political background that has that quality.
He's a party hack is what he is. He will fight for the side that he's on, and he does it really well. When he was in Parliament and he's arguing for the legislation that the NDP wanted to put forward, he was really good at getting to the meat of an issue and just attacking his opponents and defending his own position really well in those kinds of situations.
He's a very good parliamentarian.
Yes, he's very good at holding the party line. He's very good at arguing in the best possible way, given the sort of position he has to defend. But when we're talking about sort of the broader issues of what a leader of a political party needs to be capable of, it has to go far beyond that, and it has to be there has to be some reason to support him, even if you hate him. You know, beyond just he's good at arguing.
Well, Justin Trudeau has that. He has really nice hair.
Yeah, he does. He's a nice person. He's a good guy. He beat up Brazeau. That's another plus.
Everyone hates Brazeau.
Yeah, that's a plus. He's really good as far as his the metaphors he uses are nice and pleasant sounding. He has a good last name. That's important. Evocative of a former bygone era in the Liberal Party. All that sort of stuff is positives that when you've extracted out all the relevant political issues and the ideas, ultimately it does come down to who has the nicer hair.
To me, that's just forgetting everything that the NDP has fought for the last 60 years to, we've gotten so close, and this is the first election in Canadian history where the NDP maybe could have at some point actually had the chance of forming a government. And Mulcair took that, and he just tried to turn it into any other election campaign, and he's just like, any other party. And I think that he's really betrayed the principles on which the NDP is founded. And if the NDP takes a really big hit during this election, then I hate to say it, but I think it's deserved. I think that we should do better.
I don't know. There's a lot of... I've talked to a few people, like, deep in the party, the kind of people who still are sort of unaware or unwilling to talk about it. The kind of people who've been talking about, like, well, the polls for the last 2 weeks are all bullshit, so you can just ignore them. Those kinds of people.
Right. And deny. Yeah,
like, the attitude a lot of them have is more along the lines of... sure, well, maybe we'll lose. But I remember a time, I remember a time when getting 50 seats was a massive victory.
Yeah,
so we should really just be, recognizing that...
Thankful for what we have.
Yeah, thankful for what we have.
For Christ's sake.
That kind of whole thing.
Oh,
and I think
God.
that is going to be a big part of a lot of the attitude a lot of the people in the NDP.
The rationalizing that people will do. That it's not as bad as it is.
And to be fair, we will be. I mean, when we're talking about it from when we're talking about 60 years of history, the last election was exceptional. It was not just exceptional in the seat count, which it was, but it was exceptional in the fact that we gained so much support in Quebec all of a sudden, and that support hasn't gone away. Right, we're gonna get more seats in Quebec this election than any other election except the last one.
Okay, fair enough, but isn't that still kind of rationalizing?
It is, but what I'm saying is that there's plenty of room to rationalize, just because when you're talking about all those years that we've been working towards this point, and yet Thomas Mulcair seems to have screwed us. On the other hand. The other side of that coin is that, sure, but we're still doing pretty well. And the fact of the matter is that there will be another election. There will be more elections. There will be, this will carry on. And whatever situation the NDP is in, it's not good enough simply to say Thomas Mulcair screwed up, because it's not really about Mulcair. It's about these ideas, or lack of ideas, in effect, that have been sort of permeating the party at the provincial and federal level for decades.
Yeah, that's true, and I think it is important to remember that every election that you lose feels like the end of the world, Yeah. And it seemed like that every time the BC Liberals have won the election feels like the end of the world.
I
right?
remember vaguely when the NDP was reduced to 2 seats.
Yeah,
I remember that. It was
devastating.
Well, not just devastating. It was almost unbelievable. Because what happened was I don't know if you even remember this, but what happened was basically in the last week of the election, I can't remember his name, the guy who used to be running the NDP at the time, I think he's a Liberal now. Say La Vie, right? The NDP was looking at getting maybe 20 seats at around midnight or 1 in the morning. And, of those 20 seats, they were all within a few hundred votes, so they were going to go to recounts. So it didn't look like the kind of blowout that it ended up being, but everyone literally woke up the next morning finding out that, in fact, we had won, none of them. So,
Jesus.
There you go. And, I mean, it happens. That sort of stuff does happen. And I think it says something about, the fundamental core of the NDP, that a party like that can come back from 2 seats or no seats. Like, we can just what the NDP represents are principles that don't go away just because of the number of seats we have.
Yeah, or even the leader of the party at the time. If the NDP does get hammered in this election, then I think it will be an indictment of the kind of liberal path that Mulcair has tried to carve. So, I don't know. I mean, I guess at this point it's all speculation anyways, because we don't really know what's going to happen.
Yeah, I personally think that, the polls have put the Liberals at around 35, possibly even sort of edging towards 40. The Conservatives have been put around 30, possibly edging around 28. You know, they've been around there. The NDP's been around 25. I personally, if I have to make a prediction, my prediction is that the NDP will probably bounce back at least a few points. Nothing close to sort of seriously challenging the Liberal Party for the lead, but just sort of generally all these policies and ideas and things that they're now suddenly coming out with in a desperate last-bid gambit to be relevant again. I think it will have an impact. I think it'll also have just an impact in that a lot of the sort of the bullshit side issues will be jettisoned as the Conservatives move on to target the Liberal Party.
The Conservatives don't really have... I mean, their top support is pretty low. I mean, they're not going to gain a lot more than what they already have, other than their core supporters.
Yeah.
So it's really just that, you know, everyone who's not voting for Harper sort of finally deciding last minute who they're going to vote for. And
it could make a big difference.
It does. I hate to say it, but it does bother me that the elections often depend on the most undecided voters, of the people that just can't make up their damn minds and are swayed by sometimes complete petty bullshit.
And
it bothers me that our democracy is heavily dependent on them, but you know, so be it.
Yeah, and it's hardly a disaster for the NDP though, and this is what kind of worries me when it comes to Mulcair. I mean, some of the polls have put us in the lead in BC, Saskatchewan, and Quebec, right? So we'll probably come in the lead in Quebec and BC, but by seats at least, and we'll have a decent showing throughout the rest of the country. Nothing, embarrassing other than in Ontario, probably. But given that, if we get 100 seats or 90 seats or something, is he still going to resign though? Because in the NDP there is a long tradition of just keeping people on. Well,
Mulcair too is a careerist, and so he's not going to bow out unless he absolutely has to.
Yeah, and I guess that's the question. I mean, we talk about this like it's a foregone conclusion. If the NDP doesn't come in first or second at least, that Mulcair's career is over. But is it?
I think, much like Carol James, he will do anything he can to stay on, anything short of an internal revolt within the party, which is what it took to get Carol James out of the damn leadership.
I don't know. I don't even know if she could be qualify as a careerist even. Just an office holder might be better.
I don't know. She tried pretty hard to. What did she do? She stopped the regular meetings of the NDP convention and just had them half as often, so there'd be half as many opportunities to vote her out of her position.
They got rid of regular leadership conventions, which really pissed me off. But that's beside the point. What was interesting with Carol James and just what can happen with the NDP in general is that we had one of the most unpopular premiers in this province, Gordon Campbell, who was consistently in single digits as far as popularity goes. He was a dead weight around the ring, around the neck of the Liberal Party. And yet somehow, I don't know how the NDP managed to do it, we scoured the province for the one person in the province who was less popular than Gordon Campbell. And we found her, Carol James.
We shouldn't pick on her so much though, because Adrian Dix had a shoo-in election, and he still managed to fuck it up himself.
Well, and also in Ontario, there was another shoe-in election for the the NDP, but they decided, what the most important thing is, the most salient issue of this election, what people want to hear about. They want to hear about cutting funding and privatization. That's what we should be fighting for. And they lost the election because they were a bunch of right-wing idiots who just sort of figured that they could win on the basis of essentially their name and likability.
So what do you think is in store for Harper after this election, regardless of the outcome?
Well, he's promised that he would resign as leader of the Conservative Party if he doesn't form government, basically. So it gives him room. It's possible he'll still be prime minister, and if that's the case, even though it would be a unprecedented defeat for the Conservative Party, he would have plenty of he would have a reason to at least stay on for at least a few years. He's fairly old, so probably will be his last election regardless. If he doesn't win a clear majority of seats, he said, not popular vote, mind you, but seats, because he's always been very, he's always considered that to be the measurement of success for some reason. If that doesn't happen, if he is out, if the anything but conservatives get their way and the anything but conservatives are elected, he resigns, and then I've always been sort of suggesting, and I've suggested to you a lot, just like the idea that I think what has been holding the Conservatives together for a very long time has been Stephen Harper. He's concentrated so much power and influence on himself that once he leaves, for whatever reason, it's possible the Conservative Party will break apart. I'm kind of leaning towards the opposite direction now, where I think that even if Stephen Harper leaves, I think that there will be a leadership race. Probably a lot of crazy people will be involved in it.
Yeah. That we can be sure
and
of.
they'll pick just another Stephen Harper, another, probably socially conservative person who's willing to put that aside for power.
I think so too, actually. Even anyone in the Conservative Party can realize that it would be foolish to split, and this has been their only...
Yeah.
Their even from a purely Machiavellian standpoint, that's what they would want to do. And they would probably search for someone that's just like a younger version of Stephen Harper. Because it's a good electoral strategy for them.
Yeah, but here's the thing. I don't know if it is a good electoral strategy. Normally when we're talking about, defeated political leaders, the idea is that they are a spent force, that they're that the popularity of the leader is sagging below the popularity of the party, for instance. That often happens when a party's defeated. And so you replace the leader with someone who's a lot more popular, a lot more interesting, a lot more significant politically. The thing, though, about the Conservative Party is so much of what they've done has been concentrated on the leader, on Stephen Harper, on his ability and his significance, that he has, not only kept divisive issues from causing his party to split apart again, but just the significance of him as a respected person amongst conservatives. I wouldn't be surprised, I'm actually kind of expecting this, that when and if Stephen Harper resigns, the popularity of the Conservative Party actually goes down.
I think so. And also, before all of his executive ministers resigned, like Peter MacKay and whatnot, it kind of seemed like, well, now that all these people have left, who's going to replace him? But I think the best thing for the Conservative Party would be to find someone that's maybe not really well known, that can just sort of fit the mold, that doesn't have like any baggage or so I don't think the Conservative Party will split either, as much as I want them to, unless somehow through some small miracle proportional representation gets put through in Parliament, and then there's no reason for the Progressive Conservatives and the Reform Party and the socially conservative people to stay together.
Okay, well, you said you didn't want them, or you wanted them to split apart. I don't really want the social conservatives and the economic conservatives to split apart so much as I think they should split apart. I think it would be healthier. Much like the niqab issue we were talking about at the beginning, the problem is that when you sort of subvert these principles for the sake of some other principle, it doesn't go away. There are plenty of people in Parliament who want to, say, ban abortion.
Right.
The fact that they're not allowed to talk about it because of the Prime Minister means that those issues, those conversations just fester and become more and more entrenched and ingrained in people. I think it would be healthier if we had a socially conservative political party and an economically conservative political party that were able to argue for its positions, respectively, in whatever way they wish to.
I agree with you, not because I support either of them, but, also for the same reason that the Green Party should have more seats in Parliament. Because there are, as much as I dislike the Green Party, there are about 5 to 6 to 7 to 8% of people that support them, and they do deserve more than one seat.
Well, it'd be interesting what
I
would
just
happen
don't want
them.
it to be my seat.
Well, no, but I mean, right now, of all the parties that I think it's fair to say that the Green Party is probably the one that is most under control of its leader, and it has nothing to do with Elizabeth May being sort of like a control freak or anything. It's just the fact that she's got their only seat, so she has a astounding amount of influence. She can decide Green Party policy on a whim at any time. That's just what happens when you're their only MP.
Yeah, and when their actual platform doesn't.
Well, yeah, and that too.
Matter.
But it would be interesting to see if the Green Party, as it currently exists, would even be able to function, and with more than one MP. As you say, I don't want it to be my writing.
What would happen if they disagreed on something?
Well, exactly. What would happen if they disagreed on something?
Because they don't have to vote by their platform.
Well, not just that, but what happens when you go to the Green Party and you say that someone in the media wants to interview them?
Right.
Who do you interview for the Green Party position?
If they disagree on an issue.
Yeah, what's the minority view? I mean, even if you have more than two people, it still comes down to the MPs in question and which one of them is better able to articulate their viewpoints. It doesn't really come down to the party membership at all.
Well, I will definitely be anticipating and waiting with bated breath to see what the election results are. Like I said earlier, no matter if the result is positive or negative, I'm sure we will consume a lot of liquor, whether in celebration or in
It's been
defeat.
a roller coaster ride, I think it's been too long, and it's been nauseating.
Yeah, I think everyone, no matter what the outcome, is going to be a little bit relieved from everything being over, but just beginning again.
Yeah, it's only going to be a couple of years before we're going to have to do this again. Another election, another damn election, more democracy. That's why we need the monarchy back again, just to tell us what to do.
Piss off.
We can be we as what is his name? Mussolini said, the people are sick of liberty.